Hello, this is Dr. Kurt Sander, and this is Music Theory Simplified. Today's topic is about the process of modulation, specifically what we call common chord modulation. Now, that word modulation is similar to a process we looked at earlier, namely the process of tonicization. And if you recall, tonicization was where we used an altered chord or a secondary function to momentarily lend tonal weight to a different chord or a different key area. For example, if we're in C major and we want to lend tonal weight to the 5 chord or G major, we might use a 5-7 of 5 or a 7 diminished 7 of 5 or some chord like that. But with modulation, the process is different. It tends to be longer lasting. For example, if I'm starting in C major and I modulate to G major, I tend to stay in that new key for a certain amount of time. It could be as short as 3 or 4 measures, but usually it's longer. It could be a whole section of a movement. And it's this process of modulation that allows composers to achieve variety and contrast in their works. And it's this contrast that creates what we call in music form. The sonata form, for example, is a great process by which composers bring us into a contrasting key. And then when we return to the original key, it's all the more satisfying. So let me show you how this process works in terms of what we call common chord modulation. There are many ways to modulate, but this is the most common that we find. And it involves the use of a chord that exists in both keys. Let me show you what I mean. For purposes of understanding, let's think about a musical composition as a speech you might have to give. And in this speech, you might start off talking about airplanes. But at some point in the speech, you need to talk about a different topic, something completely unrelated. Let's say wet umbrellas. Now, these are two very different subjects. But in order to make the speech make sense, you would need to find a topic that's related to both airplanes and wet umbrellas. This helps you move from one topic to the next in a smooth kind of way. After pondering on all the different subjects related to these two ideas, you might come to the conclusion that clouds or rain is something that's related to both subjects. If you're in a plane, you're going to fly through some clouds. And clouds, of course, produce rain, which make umbrellas wet. So now let's turn back to music. Just as in the speech we had two different topics, in music we can have two different keys. And the best way to move from one key into another is to use chords that are common to both. Let's take a look. Here we have a D major triad. Now in the key of D major, this of course is the one chord, but we also find the D major triad in other keys as well. For example, in the key of G major, this same D major triad is not the 1, but the 5 chord. It's common to both keys. Also, in the key of A major, this same D major triad is the 4 chord. It's common to both of those keys as well. We find these common chords in what we call closely related keys. These are simply keys whose key signatures differ by one or fewer accidentals. You'll notice that when we compare D major to G major and A major, there's only one accidental that separates their key signatures. This means they are all closely related. So you might be asking yourself, for any given key, how many closely related keys are there? Well, let's take a look. Let's start with an easy key of C major. We know that the key of C major has a relative minor that shares its key signature, so A minor is closely related. But if we add one accidental to the key signature, one sharp, we can find G major and its relative minor, E minor. Both are one accidental difference. If we add a flat to the key signature of C major, we get F major and its relative minor, D minor. So in total, we have 5 closely related keys to C major. And it's interesting to note that these 5 keys also represent 5 diatonic chords within the key. The only chord missing is the 7 because we don't tonicize diminished chords. Let's take a look at how chords map up between 3 keys. Here we have C and closely related keys of F and G. Notice that the 6th chord, the A minor triad in C, is the same as the 3 chord in F and the 2 chord in G. All 3 of these are the same A minor triad. Here we have a D minor triad, which is the 2 chord in C. We can find that same chord as the 6th chord in F. But in the key of G, that chord does not exist because of that F sharp that's in the key signature. So this would not make a good pivot between C and G. Now let's take a look at 2 keys that are not so closely related. Here we have C major, and we're going to compare it to A flat major. Note the key signature of A flat major is 4 accidentals away from that of C major. This makes it distantly related. And if we compare each of the triads, we can see that there are no chords in common between these 2 keys. That makes modulation difficult. So when writing or analyzing modulations, you want to look for those places within 2 keys where the chord is the same, the quality of the chord. Now it's true that the function of the chord might change based on what key you're in, but the quality of the chord remains the same. So how do we go about analyzing these common chord modulations? It's a special tool that we call a pivot chord label. And it's a chord that represents how that one specific common chord functions in both keys. Let me show you. The pivot chord label has 2 sections, a top section and a bottom section. The top section is for the chord as it exists in the original key. In C major, we can put a 6th chord on the top, which has the notes A, C, and E. The bottom section is for the new key. Let's say it's G major. That same A, C, E chord is now a 2 chord. And from that point on, we analyze the rest of the progression in the new key. Now let's take a look at how this might occur in an actual musical example. Here's the score from a famous Bach chorale. This shows a modulation in a very condensed way. Let's listen. The key signature of this piece shows us that we are in F major, and all of the notes of the first part of the chorale reflect that key. However, if we look at the second part of the chorale, we see that there are C sharps that are not specific to the key of F major. These end in a cadence in D minor. When analyzing modulations, the best approach is to look for the appearance of the first accidental and move to the chord directly to the left. Most likely, that will be your pivot chord. So the process begins by adding a pivot chord label and analyzing the chord as it exists in the original key. The F major triad shown here in the key of F major is simply a 1 chord. Now we've determined that we're moving into D minor based on the C sharp accidentals. So we put that new key to the left of the pivot chord label and analyze that same triad in the new key. This F major chord in D minor is a 3 chord. And from that point forward, you analyze the remaining chords in the key of D minor. I hope this gives you some perspective on how common chord modulation works in music. Just to review, here are the steps that you need to follow to analyze a common chord modulation. Step 1. First, you need to know that a modulation is taking place. And you can tell this by the appearance of telltale accidentals that occur. And it's usually the same accidentals. And those accidentals will give you a clue as to what key you're in. So step 2 is to identify what key you're modulating into. Step 3 is to look at the appearance of the first accidental that lies outside the original key signature. And then move to the chord to the left. And usually that's going to be your pivot chord. In some cases, that pivot chord could be in a variety of places. Sometimes as many as 3 chords could function in both keys. You only need to label one of them. So modulation can be an excellent tool for composers. It can bring a lot of variety and contrast to your music, and through the use of this common chord, it really can make it sound seamless. This is Dr. Sander with Music Theory Simplified, reminding you to keep it simple.